Hail, adventurers! Step in. Welcome to Doom Swords. I invite you to rest your weary bodies and minds and gather around the hearth as I continue the tale of combat in advanced Dungeons and Dragons on this episode of Doom's Words.
Hey everybody, welcome back to this series discussing rules as written within the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons system, specifically related to using rules as written inside encounter and combat situations. I think last time we left off on attack rolls and how they work. There's further information beyond that, and I'd encourage you to check out the previous video in the series if you need a refresher or if you haven't seen it. But moving right along, we're going to go into attack routines and make it as far through this document that I've put together as is possible in a quick amount of time. So attack routines are an important concept in the game. So obviously you have your attacks, right, which can be any of a number of things. Attacking with a weapon, whether that be a melee weapon or a missile weapon, rather a hand-to-hand weapon or a missile weapon. You also have, it may be a claw, it may be a bite, it may be a wing buffet, it may be something magical, a breath weapon, it could be any of a number of things. Those individually are known as attacks. Attack routines are something different, and it's a very important concept. An attack routine represents the attack or group of attacks that a creature normally makes during a round. Most combatants using melee weapons have a single attack routine per round, whether they're fighting with one weapon or two. At higher levels, fighter types gain multiple melee attacks per round. Magical effects, such as those provided by the haste spell, will also grant a combatant the ability to perform additional melee attack routines during the round. In the case of monsters, such creatures generally have but one attack routine, comprised of all the attacks that they normally make in a round. Okay, so a common example of this might be the claw bite attack routine that you see used so often in the monster manual. Unless infected by a haste spell, or some such, which allows them to use that attack routine multiple times. All of these attacks are part of the same attack routine. When any combatant has multiple attack routines, the order of attacks during the combat round may be affected. So in short, what I'm basically trying to get across here is that attacking with my sword, okay, or two weapons is part of an attack routine. Attacking with my claw bite, if I'm a monster who has that sort of natural weaponry, that's an attack routine. And it's important to split that out from the concept of attacks, as we'll see later. Saving throws, I know probably everybody who's watching this knows what a saving throw is, but I want to talk about it a little bit specifically as it relates to AD&D itself. So saving throws are a mechanic in AD&D whereby a creature may mitigate or negate certain undesirable effects upon its being. Saving throws are determined by rolling a 1d20, of course, adding or subtracting any bonuses or penalties, and comparing the resultant number to a saving throw matrix. Similar to the way that we have attack matrices, we have saving throw matrices as well, that reveals the value needed to be successful in the throw. In the case of PCs, this value is determined by the character class of the individual attempting the saving throw. Most non-monster NPCs, that would be your normal humans and bandits, those types of things will make saving throws as 0 level humans. Monsters typically make saving throws as fighters of a level roughly equivalent to their hit dice, but they might save as members of another class if their abilities or characteristics specifically align more closely with that class. In other cases, a monster is supplied with a character class and level at which it makes all or some saving throws. I should clarify that when I say they make saving throws as 0 level humans, NPCs do. That is, it's basically a 0 level on the fighter saving throw matrix. With regard to monsters supplied with a character class and a level, a good example of that might be the Brownie. I believe it saves as a cleric level 9, so you would use the 9th level cleric matrix for a Brownie saving throws. A couple things to talk about with saving throws specifically. Similar to attacks, natural 20 and natural 1 mean things. So a roll of 20 for a saving throw is not automatically successful. Okay, though there's an optional rule that DMs can use to allow an unmodified roll to count as an automatic success. It's also important to note that the lowest roll that can count as a success is 2. No matter how many bonuses may be added, rolling an unmodified 1 or a natural 1, as it could be referred to, on a saving throw always results in failure. Monsters that are non-intelligent make saving throws other than those versus poison or death magic at half their normal hit dice, rounded up. That's something that people tend to forget, and I suppose for good reason, because it's just a sort of parenthetical observation listed in the saving throw table, and being that the monster manual came around first, none of that is included in there. We don't have saving throws in a standard monster manual, saving throw matrices rather, in a standard monster manual. And maybe the concept of non-intelligent creatures making saving throws at half their normal hit dice hadn't really been solidified at the time that the monster manual came out, it being the first of the core rulebooks. Monsters who have hit point pluses added to their hit dice make saving throws at a level from 1 to 4 levels higher than their number of hit dice would otherwise indicate. Similarly, this is parenthetical and included in a very small piece of text. So this is something that I would caution DMs specifically to look out for when they're trying to determine saving throw results and success or failure for saving throws for monster creatures, particularly those that have pluses or minuses to their hit dice, and those that are non-intelligent. Weapon speed factors. Each weapon is provided a single number that at once represents its wieldiness, the time taken to ready it, the time required to cover from a missed blow, and any other variables. All right, this is known as the weapon speed factor. It's an abstraction largely, but this number is very important in situations where it determines who strikes first in a combat round, or those situations where you have to determine whether a spell is completed before a weapon attack can interrupt it, as an example. So some things to talk about with weapon speed factors. When weapons are used by both combatants and their actions would otherwise be resolved simultaneously, if there's a large enough difference between the weapon speed factors of their weapons, the combatant with the lower weapon speed factor might be allowed more than one attack against his opponent. We'll get into all of these later, but it's small things that I want to point out specifically and draw out so that people understand the impact of some of these rules that a lot of DMs consider to be optional at their table, and obviously that's their right to do that. But I want to show people in sort of a list format why some of these are important. With regard to spellcasting and determining whether a spell is completed before an attack roll may be made with a weapon, which is a fairly common occurrence, there are special mechanics that are designed to make that determination. Weapon armor class adjustments. This is another rule in AD&D that this one even more, I would say, than weapon speed factors, is something that tends to get left behind, even though it makes its appearance in the Player's Handbook, which came out shortly after the Monster Manual and was the first book that players would have likely seen, if they hadn't seen the Monster Manual. So it was there from the beginning. It was on the character sheets from the beginning for AD&D, and a lot of us who grew up with it wanted to know how these work, and a lot of us tried to keep them in their games, but later generations maybe not so much. Weapons typically have advantages and disadvantages against different types of armor, which creates an attack bonus or penalty when making an attack roll against an opponent wearing armor. These adjustments apply to only weapons when used against specific armor types. Okay, not against the combatant's armor class. If a monster isn't wearing armor that's responsible for its armor class, then any attackers need make no armor class adjustments. Monsters using a weapon should, of course, be subject to these adjustments when attacking other creatures wearing armor. Something I haven't said here is that if a monster is using a natural weapon, say claws or a bite, against an opponent, a PC usually, that's wearing armor, adjustments don't apply. So these weapon armor class adjustments are only applied with weapons and are only applied against an armor type and not an armor class. So as an example, say you have chainmail +3. Say you're wearing chainmail +3. Chainmail is armor class 5. The +3 makes it armor class 2. The weapon armor class adjustment is not 2, but it's 5. I hope that makes sense. The bullet point on this one would be that while weapon armor class adjustments might be difficult to apply in a combat situation, especially on the fly, and especially when a character sheet does not support having those values listed right on the sheet for easy reference, they still provide meaningful considerations when choosing a weapon if they're used. And a lot of people who don't use these end up running their tables in such a way that most of their players and their players' characters use only one weapon. For the most part, a fighter will probably use his longsword, for example, or whatever the player has deemed his character's favorite weapon is, and only switch to a blunt weapon. Say, hey, we're fighting skeletons. Okay, I'll bust out my mace. Weapon armor class adjustments eliminate some of that static nature of combat and weapon selection and provide meaningful choices to the players, which I would agree is always a good thing to strive for. In fact, as I say here, one could remove most of the pole arms and different varieties of swords from the AD&D system without many adverse effects if you don't use this rule, right? The only thing that's really different if you don't use this rule is speed factor. And if you don't consider speed factor, then the only thing that's different is damage and weapon reach. But if you're not using speed factor and you're not using weapon armor class adjustments, you're probably not using weapon reach and space required to wield it, those kinds of things. And an examination through the player's handbook will show a large variety of polearms without weapon armor class adjustments and speed factors. They're largely just flavor text. Not necessarily that that's a bad thing. It depends on what kind of game you want to run, but I'm specifically talking about rules as written here, so that's what I'm going to focus on. Next, we come to time. Time within combat or an encounter situation is split up into three different groupings, right, or three different periods of time, and they can be looked at as sort of a zoom in and a zoom out type of thing, or a time scale change, or really however you want to portray it. These specific time periods come into play throughout most encounters in combat. So we have the segment. A segment is 6 seconds of game time. Okay, a round is 1 minute of game time, or 10 segments of game time, right? So a segment being 6 seconds, we multiply that by 10, we get 60 seconds, which is equivalent to a combat round. Combat turn, on the other hand, is 10 rounds or 100 segments of game time. Generally, you're not going to be dealing with segments to an extent that it's even a concern that there's 100 segments of game time to a single turn, but it's pointed out for clarity. Now, something we should say is that time is a very important aspect of AD&D, at least to me, because many of the game systems rely upon accurate timekeeping, and one might even go so far as to say that the game can't function as written without accurately representing time in your game when considering it in all things that might happen within the game, whether that be walking around through town, trekking across the wilderness, training, well, all of these things. And the reason for that, or at least one of the big reasons for that, is that AD&D is a game of combat and exploration, but it's also a game of resource management, okay, and unforeseen happenstances at unforeseen times, in terms of wandering monsters and those kinds of things. Carefully following time will often result in a dynamic game, a very dynamic game, that feels alive and a lot less static than if you hand wave it or don't use it. Movement, and this applies sort of everywhere within an indoor setting, but specifically what I want to talk about is movement within combat itself. So movement rates during encounters are described in inches per round, where 1 inch equals 10 feet. All right, this is largely a holdover from miniature wargaming days, where an actual measurement in inches would be made on the table, and that would determine how far a figure or group of figures could move. When movement occurs outdoors and not during combat, the movement time and scale change. But when in combat, whether indoors or outdoors, the same 10 feet per inch of movement applies to all creature movement. To determine how many feet a creature can potentially move during an encounter round, simply drop the inches designation from the base movement rate and multiply the remaining number by 10. Okay, to determine how far a creature can potentially move during an encounter segment, drop the inches designation from the base movement rate and take the remaining number and that's the amount. So if I have a movement rate of 9 inches, what that means is that I can move 90 feet, not necessarily during a combat round, but I can move 90 feet during a minute's period of time, or I can move 9 feet during a segment's period of time. The movement rates themselves are almost always divisible by 3, which makes for a nice approximation where grid squares, indoors, or hexes, outdoors, of 3 feet are used. This allows us to easily determine how many squares or hexes a creature can potentially move during an encounter round or segment without introducing overly complex calculations or changing the rules, right? If one uses 5-foot squares for their grids in AD&D, which is a common practice, either movement rates need to be changed, some special movement rate associated with only with combat will need to be used, or a limitation will need to be placed on the number of segments, say 6, during which movement can occur. I have an example of that that I can bring up, because I know the text in that Word document there is too small, and there was nothing I could do about it. Let's see where that is here. There we go. All right. So if we take a look at this, I've broken it down into 2 different subsections here. So we've got rules as written, grid squares, which are mentioned on, I think, page 10 of the DMG right at the very beginning. It suggests that the Dungeon Master's Guide suggests that normally 3 medium-sized creatures, men or what have you, can move abreast within a single 10-foot wide space. Now, that doesn't necessarily take into account weapon length and those types of considerations, but they can generally move 3 abreast. So, and that would say basically that we should use squares in those situations of 3.33 feet, meaning 3 squares to a 10-foot wide space. And if we do that, we find that the math is actually really straightforward and easy to handle, right? So I've broken down a couple of different, or several different movement rates. These are most common for characters and most bipedal humanoid type creatures. Inches per round, common movement rates would be 3, 6, 9, 12 inches per round. That translates in feet, like we talked about earlier, by multiplying by 10. That translates into 30, 60, 90, 120 feet. And then just by dropping the inches and taking the number, that translates into 3, 6, 9, and 12 feet per segment, which becomes particularly important in surprise determination, or surprise circumstances rather, and some other things that we'll see later on. Now, if we use 3.3 feet squares per segment, the math, obviously, since it's a repeating decimal, 3.33333 and so on, the math doesn't quite work out to how many squares you would be able to move per segment, but it's close enough that we can take that as an abstraction, and it results in the number of squares per segment being 1, 2, 3, or 4 based on the inches per round, right? So we can look at this. We can take the feet per segment, right, of 3 and divide it by 3, which rounded up by a small amount leaves us with 1 square per segment. So if I can move 9, I automatically know that I can move 3 squares. Now, if I use 5-foot squares per segment, it gives me vastly different results, as you would imagine. The movement rate isn't nearly as divisible into those number of squares, or you have to make major rounding decisions up or down to determine how many 5-foot squares a creature might be able to move. Now, we can clean that up we can clean up using 5-foot grid squares by using 5 foot of movement per segment, which I see people do occasionally, and I think it's much easier just to go with 3 feet per square. So if we look at what I put down here, we've got the same inches per round, feet per segment, 3.333 feet squares per segment, and 3-foot squares per segment, and 5-foot squares per segment. Okay, this is actually not correct. So inches per round of 3 would equal feet per round. Well, let's just leave that aside, and I'll point out that feet per segment becomes 5, 10, 15, and 20 if we use 5 feet of move per segment and extrapolate out the results. So 3.3 squares per segment at this rate, at the movement rate of 5 foot of movement per segment, results in some odd numbers that would require rounding up or rounding down. And I mainly put this in here to show you that 5 foot of movement per segment has a pretty big impact on the amount of movement that the rules say that we're allowed to use. So 3.3 feet squares per segment would be 1.5, 3, 4.5, 6. If we just drop the 0.3 feet as an abstraction and call it 3 squares per segment, we get 1.6 repeating, we get 3.3 repeating, 5, and 6.6 repeating. And if we use 5 foot squares per segment, then we get a nice even number. So if you want to use 5 foot grid squares, you're certainly capable of doing so. But what will tend to happen is in order to get it to fit, you're either going to have to make some serious rounding determinations that are going to have to be consistently or should be consistently applied, or you're going to have to change the scale of movement, change the movement rate across all creatures or some such. So I generally recommend, or I always recommend, and I always use 3 foot squares on my grids. That's just, or 3 foot hexes as the case is, particularly if I'm dealing in combat and encounter scenarios. So let's go ahead and get rid of that and move on. I hope that was clear. I didn't necessarily present it in the most clear way possible, but I'll move on. So encounters. An encounter might begin when any party can see, hear, smell, or otherwise become aware of another party that's within their general vicinity. Not all encounters result in combats, but all combats occur during encounters. So you can think of an encounter as the parent of the combat or anything else that might happen, right? So let's think about a combat situation where 2 groups come. Basically, an encounter is when 2 groups meet each other. Whatever happens within that is considered to have occurred within the encounter. Often, a combat will result, sometimes fleeing, sometimes parley. Any of those things are things that are considered to happen during encounters. If we're trekking through the wilderness and we don't encounter anything, then obviously we don't have an encounter. But typically, once the DM has adjudicated that an encounter is possible, all parties to the encounter will roll for surprise. Note that the DM is responsible for the circumstance of the encounter and may rule that there's a surprise modifier, that only one of the parties might be surprised, that neither of the parties can be surprised. That is to say that they're aware of each other and so forth. So ultimately for the DM, it's important to think about those situations and not use surprise and encounter distance and these types of things, to not always use those. Those are meant to be used in situations where you have wandering encounters that have been randomly determined, say, or situations where the DM simply doesn't know or wants to use random results. So this rule exists, surprise, but when it's used is a matter of DM adjudication and arbitration, at least as far as I'm concerned. So at the beginning of an encounter, whether or not a combat is sure to start, the relative awareness of each party will usually be dice for, right? This is known as surprise and is rolled with 1d6 for each group collectively. We don't individually roll that. We roll that collectively. So one group rolls a d6, the other group rolls a d6. Generally, a result of 1 or 2 on the die indicates surprise for the concerned party for a number of segments equal to the die roll. So if we have 2 groups, Group A and Group B, Group A rolls a 2, then Group A is surprised for 2 segments. If Group A rolls a 1, then Group A is surprised for 1 segment. Same thing with Group B. Surprise creatures are incapable of performing any actions until the duration of surprise is complete. The opponents of surprise creatures are free to act for a like amount of time as the unaware group is caught unawares. Some monsters, races, and classes surprise more often or surprise less often. If a creature is surprised less often than normal, that ability is granted to the creature's entire party. Okay, so you kind of look at that as if you're traveling along with somebody who's generally more aware and therefore less surprised than the remaining members of your group. He's certainly, provided he doesn't have to travel alone to have that ability afforded to him, he's capable of alerting everyone else in the group, hey, look, there's something going on over here. So a reduction in the likelihood of surprise is generally applied to the entire group of creatures traveling with whoever has that ability, while the opposite, a creature being capable of surprising opponents more often than normal, that ability is not conferred to the entire party. So generally that might be a situation, say you're traveling with an elf, right? Who's capable of surprising more often than a human is. Well, naturally, that's not going to apply unless the elf is traveling alone or so far ahead that the humans and other people who don't have that same ability are able to affect the or able to benefit from the elf surprise. Right. So if surprise is indicated, it's possible that combat will be avoided by the unsurprised opponent deciding to flee. It's also possible that combat will be initiated by the unsurprised party. Encounter distance must be known and is determined next. Right. Note that it's possible for all parties to be surprised, in which case surprise has no practical effect. Or that should say where all parties to be surprised equally. If they're equally surprised, they're incapable of doing anything, either of them, for a like amount of time. They're both just completely unaware of the other, and you might think of that as somebody who doesn't belong in your house walking in your front door as you're trying to walk out. There's likely to be a few seconds before you decide to do whatever you do when you get when your home gets invaded. A couple things to talk about with this is if both parties are surprised and their surprise die results are different, the lesser number is subtracted from the greater number to determine how many segments the party with the higher die roll is surprised for, while the other party is able to act. So two groups capable of surprising each other equally, let's say Group A and Group B. If Group A rolls a 1, indicating one segment of surprise, and Group B rolls a 2, indicating two segments of surprise, then we're going to subtract the 1 from the 2, resulting in a number of 1. And that's for how long the group with the higher roll, because remember here, higher rolls in surprise are worse because they represent the number of segments that you're surprised, would leave party B with 1 segment of surprise and party A with 1 segment during which they can perform actions. Surprise can be a little bit difficult to wrap your head around in that way because a surprise roll, you want to roll high, okay, to determine whether or not you're surprised, but the quality of the roll depends on rolling a low number, right? So you won't in standard surprise, a 1 through 2, a low number indicates surprise, a high number does not. On the other hand, a high number, if you are surprised, is a negative result. But it makes sense once you dig into it and once you actually see it in action. So surprise segments, what do we do with those, right? Surprise segments are special in that they allow some actions to occur as if each surprise segment were a full round. We'll talk plenty more about that later. Unencumbered creatures who have a dexterity, attacking, or reaction adjustment subtract that dexterity, attacking, or reaction adjustment from the total number of segments that their group is surprised for to arrive at a number that represents the net total number of segments that individual is surprised for. That doesn't change for the whole group or anything like that. An example of this would be, a thief traveling along with a party. Surprise is diced for. It's determined that the party is surprised for 1 segment. The thief has a +1 reaction and attacking adjustment based on dexterity. We subtract that from the 1 segment that the party is naturally surprised for, yielding a result of 2 for that thief. So that thief is, in fact, not surprised. Okay. We talk about doing that only for unencumbered creatures, and we'll talk about what that means when we get into some actual examples. But it's important to note that dexterity, reaction, and attacking adjustment penalties from having a bad dexterity, say being clumsy or whatever the case may be, those always apply. Okay. These bonuses or penalties are only applied if the creature's party would normally be surprised. Okay, they don't create surprise in otherwise unsurprised individuals or anything like that. So it's a modification to the result of the surprise, only if there is surprise, not a modification of the dice roll used to determine whether in fact surprise exists or not. Some creatures surprise or are surprised more or less often than normal, and some creatures even use a different surprise die. These are special cases, and we'll learn how to deal with them later. In any case, the ability to surprise more often is not conferred to the entire party, while the ability to be surprised less often is. Encounter distance, right? When encounters occur in AD&D, encounter distance must be determined. While the DM may arbitrarily determine the encounter distance, as with many other things, and like we talked about with determination of surprise and whether or not it's actually necessary based on what the DM knows about the circumstances of the encounter, there are rules present in AD&D for making this determination randomly. The distance ranges are different depending upon whether the encounter occurs indoors or outdoors, line of sight, noise, area in which the encounter takes place, sudden appearance out of nowhere, say under ambush circumstances by one or more parties, affect it. Surprise, light sources, absence of light sources for either or both groups. Any of these considerations can affect the encounter distance in a variety of ways. So we move on to initiative. Once we know all this, once we've resolved surprise and we've determined encounter distance, if not known, we move to initiative to initiate the combat. So that's the term given to the order in which the participants of the combat will be able to begin and or complete whatever actions they desire to perform during the combat round. Generally speaking, the combatants with the highest initiative roll begin to perform actions first. The combatants with the second highest roll begin to perform actions second, and so on. Initiative is rolled with 1d6 at the beginning of each combat round and rolled by each group collectively. So similarly to how we make a surprise roll for each group collectively, we make a surprise roll or an initiative roll for each group collectively. Now, simultaneous initiative occurs when one or more combatants possess the same, the same initiative result. In such cases, unless something within the rules indicates that any actions might happen before or after other actions, all actions happen at roughly the same time. So simultaneous initiative just indicates if Group A and Group B both have initiative scores of 2, then all of the actions that those groups perform against each other are going to happen at roughly the same time within the combat round. So a couple things to talk about with initiative. Prior to initiative being rolled, the DM should determine himself what the opposing creatures will do without telling the players. And it's important to me at least, for the DM to be honest in his personal assessment of what the monsters or opponent characters or what have you are going to do. I mean, that's only fair. And then he'll ask the players what their characters will do. Players of spellcasters must declare the specific spell they wish to cast, if any, but other players can generally, determined by the DM, be less specific in their declarations of character intent. Right. So for a spellcaster, he must specifically say, "I'm casting magic missile at the orc." Right. For a fighter, it might be sufficient based on DM determination. It might be sufficient for him to say, I'm going to attack with my sword. You know, there might be 3 orcs in front of him. He might not necessarily have to specify which one he's going to attack, and that kind of thing. It's more of a general determination in the case of somebody who's actually using weaponry, whether natural or not, to attack his opponent. But since spellcasting is initiated immediately, the spellcaster must always declare specifically which spell it is that he is casting. So this is an important one. Any delay by a player in declaring his character's intentions should result in a like amount of time measured in segments being applied as a penalty to his initiative result. I'm not, necessarily talking about a player asking a DM for clarification if he needs it to determine what his character is going to do. Of course, you would want to limit that in order to keep combat moving along smoothly. But we're more talking about, okay, hey, Bob, what's your ranger going to do? Flips through a couple of pages. If I've taken 12 seconds to do that as the player, then it's well within the DM's right to penalize me for 2 6-second segments for my lack of, or for my indecision. Okay. A lot of DMs won't do this. I recommend that they do. Players, good players, particularly, or players who are invested in the game and want to learn to be great players, should know what they're going to do. Any conversation between the players about what their characters are going to do strategically and that kind of stuff during the declarations, I don't allow that. Whether I come right out and say, hey, okay, you guys can't do that, or more likely say something like, okay, well, the monsters heard you. You guys took 10 or 12 seconds, 2 segments talking about this, so you're going to be penalized 2 segments on your initiative. And players will usually get the hint after the DM does that a few times. Unencumbered creatures who are using missile weapons add their dexterity, reaction, attacking adjustment bonus to their individual initiative result. And all creatures using missile weapons who have a penalty of this sort apply it regardless of encumbrance. So unencumbered creatures, okay, they add their dexterity, reaction, attacking adjustment bonus, which is usually specified as a negative number to their initiative result. Flipping it around, right? And all creatures using missile weapons who have a penalty of this sort apply it regardless of their encumbrance. Okay, so if you're heavily encumbered and you're naturally clumsy, you're still going to you're still going to suffer from the negative effect from the penalty. If you're lightly encumbered, not encumbered, then you'll get to take advantage of the abilities that your heightened dexterity affords to you. Some magic items allow for a creature to automatically attack first, regardless of initiative. Okay, those are generally listed in the DMG. Any combatant being able to perform multiple attack routines alters the order in which attacks occur within initiative. Special rules govern simultaneous initiative with weapon speed factors being critically important to those adjudications under those circumstances. Spellcasting is a special case which will be discussed later. Charging into combat is a special case which will be discussed later. But both of those are handled a little bit differently, and it's important that we get an understanding of how that works, which we will do. So in summary, combat in AD&D, it starts after determining surprise and encounter distance. The combat sequence is broken down into 1 minute rounds. In certain circumstances, the combat round will be zoomed in to 6-second interval segments. Regardless of whether rounds or segments or both are in play during any part of combat, they were designed to help manage the flow of battle and give both players and the DM clear expectations about the timing of actions within each round. The 1 minute round duration is designed to simulate a variety of actions from movement to multiple attacks, ensuring that the mechanics of the game can be applied consistently and quickly. Consistency is a big thing in any game you're going to run. In AD&D, it's no different. So the whole of the combat mechanics, in my opinion, should provide a structured framework within which any actions can be resolved in a manner that feels reasonably realistic. AD&D isn't about hyper-realism, but rather about simulating epic, heroic battles in a fantasy setting. In order to be truly successful, such a framework should allow for strategic decision making. The players and the DM should be able to use the rules and leverage the rules to make tactical decisions. Those decisions involving positioning, spellcasting, weapon choice, other actions they might take, say drinking a potion or climbing walls or that sort of thing during the combat round, and more. It should provide for consistency in any matters that it can, while helping everyone involved to instinctively estimate when an action takes place. Ultimately, it should strike a balance in complexity, offering enough detail to make combat engaging and strategic without bogging it down in minutiae, thus preserving the game's narrative and pace. And there's where we get to what this video series really boils down to, and what I want to discover along with anybody who's interested in such a thing. Does AD&D rules as written, related specifically to combat, do the above, and does it do it well? That's about all. Next time, what I've done is I've written a little program to simulate some of these rules so that we can get a clearer idea of whether or not they actually affect combat in a meaningful way. And I think that the results might surprise you. Anyway, to anybody who's made it this far, I appreciate you sticking around. I appreciate you listening. I've had a ton of coffee, so I'm like super jittery today. And so ignore, please, any mistakes I've made. If there's a particularly egregious mistake, feel free to correct me. And I hope you enjoyed it. Have a nice day.